Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on Forgotten Weapons. I am Ian McCollum, and as always, all of our questions today have come from some of the fine folks who support the channel on Patreon. It is thanks to you that we're able to continue doing this on the same standard regular basis that we do. So let's get right into this. We have 25 questions today, and the first one comes from Evil Cheese. In your opinion, which is better and why? Disintegrating links or presumably non-disintegrating belts? This, I would love to get in with the first question being an easy yes-no answer. Unfortunately, however, this is an it depends answer. There are pros and cons to both, both in a military sense and in looking at it from today's recreational or collector shooter perspective. The advantage, well, originally continuous belts were how machine guns were fed. And the thing that really caused this to change, the thing that drove the development of the linked belts, which disintegrate, was aircraft use. So as early as World War I, you had this issue of, sure, a belt holds 250 rounds, but let's say you fired 210 of them. You've got 210 rounds worth of belt hanging out the end of the gun. And if you're in an airplane, that's like 6-8 feet of belt flapping around, potentially hitting the pilot, potentially hitting the airplane. We're talking about a cloth-skinned airplane. It might actually conceivably damage the aircraft. It might get stuck in something. There's a lot of potential problems to having extra belt flapping around. So metallic links were designed such that every time a round fired, the link that held that individual round would be ejected basically just like a spent cartridge case. They were disposable, and they solved that problem. Now, in theory, that could have been adapted to the ground use that early. However, those links were relatively complicated and expensive to make. They may look like very simple little individual pieces, but remember, as with magazines, the guns, all of the gun's reliability is in the hands of the quality of the feed device. So you can have a Maxim gun, one of the world's most reliable machine guns ever made, but if you've got substandard links put together into a belt to feed it, well, then the gun may not run very well at all, and you've wasted all the potential of the Maxim gun. So metallic links weren't adopted really, well, by the US until late in World War II. They continued to see use with aircraft in World War II and before then. The thing is, we didn't really have belt-fed light machine guns until about World War II. The Germans were the first to work on this with their universal machine guns with the MG34. You'll notice on the MG34, while it does use a continuous belt, it is a metallic belt, not a cloth one at this point. Those belts were made up of 50-round segments, so you never had more than 50 rounds hanging out the side of the gun. Prior to that, belt-fed machine guns didn't really move around all that much. I suppose the exception being the 0815. But if you're on a tripod in a fixed position, having a bunch of loose belt hanging out, spent belt hanging out the side of the gun doesn't really matter because it's not really going to get in the way of anything. And those are relatively easy to round up and reload and reuse. While the links are certainly better for people who are moving with the gun because you don't want to be dragging this long tail of belt behind you, the problem is, well, they're much more disposable. As a civilian shooter, the idea of going out and having a fun day on the range, well, okay, you want to pick up your brass just to be clean, but you also then need to pick up all those links if you want to reuse them, and that's kind of a pain in the butt. It's a lot more convenient to have them all hooked together into a single belt and be able to just pick that up and toss it back in your truck. We see mostly disintegrating belts today, metallic links. That kind of has proven to be the preferable choice. The people have figured out how to manufacture them accurately and relatively efficiently, and they solve some problems, and nobody really minds in a military sense about those little links being disposable. Although I will be told by some military folks that when they are doing training shooting, they are expected to round those up and return them. I'm sure that happens. On an actual battlefield, I don't think anyone would actually expect that or count on it. So, second question is from Austin. Said, I have noticed trends in locations of major manufacturing centers, i.e. Springfield, Massachusetts, Liège, Belgium, and others. Is that based on like-minded individuals coming together and creating communities of firearms manufacturers, or do they happen to share similar geographic properties that help them to be successful locations for firearms building and design? They absolutely share geographic properties, and the most significant one is historically access to waterways. So early factories were all based on water power. You'd have a water wheel, and you would take moving, flowing water and tap it for energy to run machine tools. And so you will find pretty much all of the original manufacturing centers included access to water power, at least early on. Springfield certainly did. And then you also generally have access to high quality ore. You need some way to have steel to make guns, or at least iron early on to make guns. And so areas like Liège and Eibar in Spain are areas that have easy, close access to these sorts of metal deposits. Birmingham, as well, same thing. So when you get the areas where you historically find centers of firearms manufacture are going to be those where you have both water for power and good iron ore for materials. And then, of course, once they're established, even when you get to a point like today, where we're not dependent on water power anymore for machine tools, well, you already have all the infrastructure there, the expertise there, all of the supporting industries. Your proof houses are located in those areas. Distribution networks have been built up around those areas. So once they've been established, then they tend to stick around for a long time. Next question is from Hartley. It said, how did the French get away with using 7.5x54 into the 70s when everyone else in NATO / the free world went 308, either willingly or otherwise? I'm imagining an alternative world where the MOS 4956 were all originally in 308, and many MOS 36s were converted to 308 by French state arsenals. I bet you would like living in this world. It would be convenient, although I have to point out that we don't have the glut of surplus 7.62 NATO that we used to. I remember when that stuff was super cheap. It's not really anymore, and if you actually look at it today, the cost of buying factory new, like PPU 7.5 French, is very similar to the cost of buying decent quality 7.62 NATO, either surplus or new. So, and by the way, that 7.5 French is not generally difficult to find. So the cost, it used to be that 7.5 French was like this prohibitively expensive thing, and if you ever wanted to shoot a gun, well, you better make sure you got one that was converted to NATO. That's not really the case anymore. Anyway, to answer the actual question, in the mid-1960s, well, actually kind of in a process through the early to mid-1960s, France actually took itself out of NATO's integrated military command. And this was largely based on Charles de Gaulle's desire for a very independent France. He was really concerned about the idea of France being seen as, or potentially being, or in reality being somewhat subservient to the United States in terms of military defense. He didn't like a lot of the mutual defense aspects of NATO, thinking that it would have restricted France from acting unilaterally in a way that it saw fit, in favor of basically the United States, the NATO doing whatever the United States insisted. So for that reason, in 1966, the French Air Force and Army pulled themselves out of NATO's integrated military, and that's basically the reason why France never adopted the 7.62 NATO cartridge. As far as the cartridge they did adopt, actually, I think in a lot of ways it would have been better if NATO had adopted the 7.5 French. The cartridges are very similar, but 7.5 is just a little bit less powerful. It's a little tiny incremental step closer to an intermediate cartridge, and overall, given an option between the two, I'd rather have the 7.5. They are, by the way, both identical bullet diameters, despite the difference in nomenclature. If I remember correctly, the 7.5 is a 139 grain bullet as opposed to the NATO 150 grain bullet. And I think the 7.5 has a slightly lower muzzle velocity, which I probably should have looked up before doing this, but I didn't. So there we go. It is a slightly less powerful round and thus slightly easier to shoot well. Next question is from Pete. Sorry about this, Pete. This is the fourth time I have asked if the CMMG Guard's mechanism has merit. I was going to give it up, but your FAMAS exploits spurned me for one last try. It's like the FAMAS or SETME, but it's an AR. I can't help being intrigued. I don't know that I would say it's like the FAMAS or the SETME. I have never actually handled a CMMG Guard, so I did a little bit of poking around online to see what they are. It turns out they are basically sort of a delayed blowback twist on the AR bolt. So these are in pistol calibers. They're pistol caliber AR carbines, I guess you'd say. And the idea is they take an AR-15 bolt, but they cut the back surface of the lugs at about a 45-degree angle. The idea being that when you fire, this is still a blowback system, because when the bolt gets pushed back against the locking recesses, those angled surfaces on the lugs cause the bolt to rotate of its own accord. It's not cycled back by a gas piston. It's not actually physically locked. All you have to do is push hard enough on the bolt and it will rotate and open. And that's basically the definition of a delayed blowback system. Now, the FAMAS and the SETMI are also both delayed blowback, but they are both completely different designs of delayed blowback. If someone were to ask me what the CMMG Guard is most similar to, the first thing that actually comes to mind is the Savage automatic pistols. They have a rotating barrel system, but other than the fact that it's the barrel instead of the bolt, the system pretty much works the same. There's an angled surface, and when the cartridge fires and pressure blows back onto the bolt face, it simply forces the barrel to rotate slightly, after which the slide is allowed to open. So does this have merit? It seems to. Having never handled one, I can't really give a definitive answer, but the concept seems perfectly valid. What you get from it is perhaps where the question is. What you would get from it is being able to have, basically, you'd be able to use the same cartridge as a simple blowback AR action, AR pistol caliber conversion, but you would need a less massive bolt because you have this rotating mechanism that gives you a little extra delay in the bolt opening. In a simple blowback system, all the delay comes from just the mass of the bolt and the power of the spring, mostly the mass of the bolt. So it'll give you a little bit lighter bolt and presumably a little bit lighter spring pressure as well. Having not handled one, I can't say if that leads to any substantial difference in how the gun feels under recoil. It doesn't seem to me that it would be all that substantial. So I guess whether it has merit depends a lot on how much they cost. Next question is from Aaron. It says, how was proofing done? Was there a government office that fired the gun with a charge or some policy specifically for non-military firearms? Well, kind of, sort of. Proof houses are kind of in this weird legal zone in that they're, as a general rule, they're sort of quasi-governmental agencies. Originally, most proof houses, and I'll admit I haven't done, it would be interesting to do a lot of actual research or visit some of the European proof houses. In fact, that'd be fun to do and really dig into this. But as a general concept, most of them started as guild associations. So in England in particular, the London Proof House, for example, is one of the original livery companies of the City of England, and it was established back in the 1600s, I believe. And it was a literal part of the guild system. In order to protect the gun-making trades, the guild instituted a requirement for proofing that you couldn't, and they got a royal decree supporting them. You couldn't sell a firearm unless it had been proofed by the guild. And what this meant is some yahoo in his shed couldn't put together guns and start selling them, undercutting all of the professional gun makers and potentially endangering people if he was making unsafe products. So you have a similar situation with the original Saint-Étienne proof house in France. The Liège proof house, I believe, was the same way. In France, in the mid-1800s, the Saint-Étienne proof house moved from being a private operation, where it had been a guy who ran the proof house, and he charged a fee, and he would conduct proofing on the gun and then stamp it if it passed. That passed into the hands, the management of local and then national governments. As far as the actual process, yeah, there is a literal legal standard for what the proof is, and it's typically something like a double charge of powder. Sometimes they'll specify a bullet weight or whatever specific, very overpressure charge that nation's lawmakers decide to be the standard for proofing. And every firearm that is going to be sold in public has to be subjected to that test, and it has to pass it. And typically there are multiple stages to proofing, where you will have to proof a barrel by itself. So barrels, when they are manufactured as just blanks, or once they're chambered, those have to be proofed. And then when they are assembled into firearms, the complete firearm also has to be proofed. You'll often find, for example, on revolvers, you'll typically find that the barrel is proofed and each one of the cylinders is individually proofed. Sometimes the bolts have to be proofed as well as part of this process. Sometimes they aren't marked. It's largely a system of what are the parts which, if they fail, the gun will catastrophically explode and potentially injure someone. Those are generally the parts that are proofed. So usually barrels, and on the case of revolvers, cylinders. Next question is from Michael. Says, hi Ian, could you tell us about the 6mm Lee Navy cartridge, its history, development, its pros and cons, and most importantly, why it failed as a service round? So I tell you what, I'll give you a brief answer here, and then I think this would be a good subject for a specific standalone video. Basically, the 6mm Lee Navy was a cartridge that was ahead of its time. It was a very small bore cartridge for the era. It was a very early smokeless powder round. The Navy liked it because it had a lot of penetration, because it was a small bullet, the large sectional density, and because it had a very high muzzle velocity for the period. The problem was that high muzzle velocity was the result of very hot powder combustion, and it wore out barrels. It eroded out the throats of Lee Navy rifle barrels and Colt 1895 machine gun barrels, and that was basically why it ended up being dropped. In conjunction with logistical questions about having the Marines and the Army equipped with the same cartridge. So, of course, by 1917, you would have the U.S. Marines deploying in a very non-Marine setting in the First World War. And by that point, you really didn't want the Navy and the Army having different cartridges and substantially different armament systems. Before that, it didn't really matter. The Navy, the Marines, the Marine Corps were kind of their own self-contained apparatus. So, like I said, I will do a more in-depth full video on the 6mm Lee Navy because it is something that deserves it. For now, though, we will move on to our next question, which is from Tom, who says, recently the Argentinian army selected the Beretta ARX-200 in 7.62 NATO to replace their FALs. This makes Argentina one of many countries like Turkey, Chile, Norway, and Pakistan that refuse to adopt a high-velocity 5mm cartridge like the 5.56 NATO or an intermediate cartridge like 7.62x39. Why do you think this is? Is it a logistics thing where they want their machine guns to have the same ammo as their rifles? Do you think there is still a place in modern militaries for battle rifles like the G3 and newer designs like the ARX-200? You touched on one of the issues there, the idea of having your rifle and your basic machine guns all firing the same cartridge definitely makes sense from a logistical point of view. I think there is also a question, especially in more recent times, about body armor. And if you as a military are concerned about fighting an enemy force equipped with body armor, and we especially would have seen this a decade or two ago when military body armor was being adopted, but it was like all flak vests. I guess that would be from Vietnam forward, really. Those flak vests are going to be absolutely no match for a 7.62 NATO cartridge. Even today, it's a much different question of whether your military body armor will stop 7.62 NATO, especially AP 7.62 NATO, versus 5.56 NATO, and especially at longer ranges. So I think there is some justification there for militaries to stick with the larger cartridge, and of course, barrier penetration. That certainly comes up in the military setting of being able to shoot through thin wooden bunkers, shoot through walls of buildings, shoot through thin-skinned vehicles, all manner of things that soldiers naturally are going to take cover behind. That's one of the advantages of 7.62 NATO. So does it have a valid place in today's military world? Potentially. It comes down to a question of whether all of those factors are more important to a particular military than the advantages of 5.56 NATO, which are, generally speaking, being able to carry more ammunition and being able to shoot faster and more accurately. It's a legitimate trade-off. Next question comes from Autumn. Is there a reason why triggers on the older French rifles, the Chassepot, Gras, Lebel, Berthier, RSC, and Meunier, to name a few, are relatively straight without much curvature to them. Was this simply tradition? It's interesting. It kind of was tradition, but it was actually a little bit more practical than just being tradition. So I don't know exactly why that straight trigger was originally adopted on the Chassepot. It's there. It's an interesting style. It looks a little distinctive, but it certainly works just fine. However, when you start going forward from there, the Gras was originally conceived and purchased as an update to the Chassepot. The idea was to convert existing Chassepots to the Gras pattern. So if there's no reason to change the trigger, why bother? So the Gras has the same trigger as the Chassepot. Then when we move forward again to the Lebel, well, there were actually a couple intermediary rifles, and the 1884 pattern French Army rifle it used a Kropatschek tube magazine, and it was also marketed and sold to the French military, well, within their own establishment, as an upgrade kit to the Gras. So again, the trigger works, nothing wrong with it, why change it? So the 1884 and 1885 pattern rifles, and there was, by the way, in 1874/85, it was a Gras converted to a Kropatschek tube magazine design. It's going to carry forward that same trigger. Still works, why change it? Then, of course, the Lebel was introduced, and the Lebel itself was an absolutely rush job of a rifle. They had like 6 months to design a new rifle around this smokeless powder and present it. So what the French engineers had to do was take the best thing they had at the time, which was this 1885 Kropatschek style tube magazine repeater, and adapt it to the new 8mm cartridge and the smokeless powder. So of course they're doing that. They have very little time to mess with anything. The trigger still works. We still have no reason to change it. So now the Lebel has that distinctive straight trigger. Moving forward, now this doesn't quite apply to the Berthier. However, I think that one we can ascribe to tradition. It's worked on all of these. Naturally, we'll just use the same trigger. When we get to the RSC 1917 rifles, the semi-auto rifles, those are, you may see this coming now, presented as an upgrade package to the Lebel. For example, that's why the gas piston is located exactly as it is on the 1917. It's because you can mostly keep the handguard from the Lebel, and that long tube that had been a magazine is now a gas piston slot. So once again, the trigger, in this case, they actually kind of need new triggers, but because it's an upgrade package, they're going to leave the design the same, and that same trigger carries over, and it wouldn't be until finally with the MOS 36 that they went to a new style of trigger. So it's not just tradition, it's actually like literally carried over from design to design to design to design all the way through the end of World War I. Next up is Dylan, who says, what revolver would you carry if you lived in the Old West? There are two answers to that, I think. The cool guy answer is because I wouldn't necessarily carry the best gun. I'd carry like the coolest gun. I would maybe say the Merwin and Hulbert, a bird's head gripped 3.5-inch barrel Merwin and Hulbert in 4440 would be a fantastic revolver. They were extremely high quality guns, but they weren't necessarily actually the best fighting handgun of the Old West period. That honor, in American terms, would probably go to the Smith & Wesson Schofield pattern guns because of that break open action. The Merwin and Hulbert it's cool. It's got this slick system where when you break it open, it'll dump empty cases, but it won't dump live rounds if you still have live rounds in the cylinder. The problem is, in order to actually load it, you're back to just a gate, open the gate and load cartridges one at a time, which is slow, like the Colts. The Schofield, you break it open, it ejects all 6 rounds immediately, and then you have easy access to drop 6 new rounds in. Same as the Webley revolvers. So the Schofield is almost certainly the best technical fighting revolver of that period. I might carry it as a result. Or I might not be that concerned about having the most practical gun, and I might want to have something really cool like a Merwin and Hulbert instead. Next question is from Lurker45. Says, the 1902 Madsen light machine gun has a box magazine that has no feed lips. This is correct. Since the feed lips are the most difficult part of a magazine to reliably manufacture, why was this apparent alternative not more thoroughly explored? I think basically because it made the magazines kind of awkward. There were a couple other guns that used that system, most notably the Johnson, US 1941 and 44 Johnson light machine guns used a very similar magazine. The issue is when you're doing that, you're now dependent on this piece of spring steel basically riveted to the outside of the magazine to hold the cartridges in place. It creates some handling quirks where it is possible with those magazines, if you mishandle them, to have all of the cartridges go flying out of the magazine if you manage to dislodge that keeper that holds the cartridges in. Normally, feed lips would be responsible for holding the cartridges in the magazine. With the Johnson magazine, interestingly, you actually have like 5 rounds worth of capacity in the action. If you pull the magazine out, you end up with some loose rounds floating around. And then on top of it, it turned out once you figured out how to do it, making stamped magazines with feed lips wasn't that big of a deal, again, once you figured out how to do it. And they were certainly less complicated to manufacture at that point than a magazine where you have to stamp the magazine body, and then you also have to have a spring-loaded retainer piece that gets attached to the magazine. Once you add in, carrying the things in pouches, I don't know. Those types of magazines aren't the worst thing ever, but I can see, I guess, why for the sake of familiarity and just standardization, nobody really followed up on that design idea. I would also point out that the Madsen mechanism really requires that style of magazine, because in the Madsen, the bolt doesn't cycle back and forth. The bolt actually pivots up and down, kind of like a Martini Henry. And cartridges are fed in, they come down from the magazine, and then they are pushed over laterally and then into the chamber. And there isn't, because of the way the bolt operates in a Madsen, you don't have an option to have a cartridge go directly forward from the magazine into the chamber. So they have to be able to come out of the magazine and then sideways. And that makes a traditional feed lip arrangement kind of impossible in that action. Next question is from David. It says, why did it take so long for Germany to field a self-loading rifle, the G43, in World War II? As a nation with advanced and reliable automatic weapons production, one would think that producing an 8mm Mauser self-loading rifle and fielding it would be simple. Is this assumption incorrect? No, your assumption is entirely correct. And in fact, not just an 8mm rifle, the Germans actually, or Heinrich Vollmer, did a lot of developmental work on an intermediate cartridge select fire self-loading rifle in the 1930s and came up with a design that was actually not bad. However, the thing is, the German military was starting from a very small scale. The military that had been allowed under Versailles was very limited in size. It was limited in armaments, aircraft, tanks, ships. All of those things were heavily restricted by the Versailles Treaty. And when Hitler decided to start rebuilding the German military, he had, of course, limited funds and a lot of potential places to put them. And the decision was basically made that a self-loading rifle wasn't important enough to justify. Instead, in terms of small arms, the Germans focused heavily on the machine guns. And they came up with a really effective machine gun, the MG34, which was almost indisputably the best general-purpose machine gun in existence at that time. By leaving the Kar-98K as the standard infantry rifle, it was expensive enough to produce the huge stockpile of Kar-98K rifles that were required for the newer, greater German military. Trying to do that with a self-loading rifle that was going to be 2 or 3 times as expensive, as well as having a developmental process to go through, it was seen as not worth it at the time. Now, judging from what they then proceeded to do during the war, maybe one could say that decision was incorrect at the time. On the other hand, if they had decided to try and build up a self-loading rifle before the war started, they may have ended up in a position like the Soviet Union, where they adopted the SVT-40, and it proved to be not really the right solution, and the Soviets stopped producing the SVT-40 when they came under severe economic strain. So, I don't want to sound wishy-washy, but all of these questions are ultimately balancing acts between a lot of different factors. So, and also, by the way, the first German self-loading rifle was actually the G41. They made over 100,000 G41 Walther production G41s, and those guns were out well before the G43s. So it wasn't that long into the war before the Germans did, in fact, have a reasonably decent semi-auto rifle. And also remember that the MKB-42 was really the world's first assault rifle, and that was also out in the field. Certainly, if Hitler hadn't deliberately obstructed its development, that would have been fielded by 1942, if not maybe 41. So they did have the capability, they just chose not to use it in this circumstance. Next question is from Alex. Ian, do you think that a modernized version of the Johnson light machine gun, the 1941, 1944, the IMI drawer, would be a practical battle rifle today, chambered in .7.62 NATO, fed from AR-10 pattern magazines with a redesigned recoil system, maybe even a rotating bolt? Well, the Johnson already has a rotating bolt. It has basically the exact same style of bolt as the AR-15. However, I do not think that a modernized Johnson would be a practical military weapon today, because it is a recoil-operated rifle. And what history has shown us and development has shown us is that really the best two options for an infantry rifle are going to be gas operation and delayed blowback. Recoil-operated guns just cause too many problems. On a recoil-operated gun, the barrel is moving on every shot back and forth, and that means you have to have bearing surfaces to support the barrel. This brings up manufacturing issues because you need that barrel to go back to the exact same place every time, especially if your sights are connected to, say, the barrel shroud instead of the barrel itself, or if your front sight's on the barrel but your rear sight's not on the barrel. Having the barrel reciprocate introduces problems there. It introduces potential reliability problems. What happens if you get dirt or debris on these bearing surfaces, which are oftentimes exposed to the outside elements? Bayonets have been traditionally a sticking point for recoil-operated rifles. One could argue today that the bayonet's obsolete and we don't care about it, but historically, if you add a big chunk of weight onto a recoil-operated gun, you've now substantially changed its operating characteristics. Now the barrel weighs more, and so maybe it doesn't always recoil quite as far as it needs to and causes reliability problems. That's why the bayonet for the Johnson is this pretty much useless little dinky spike thing, so that it can be light enough to not appreciably impact the operation of the gun. For all of those reasons, there really aren't any advantages that recoil operation brings to the table in a shoulder-fired rifle to balance out those downsides. Next question is from Keith. This will be a simple one. Do you think that 5.56 is due for replacement? No. I guess I should expand a little bit. 5.56, I think, does everything that it needs to, and the cost of replacing it would be so monumentally high that none of the replacements are good enough to justify replacing it. I think any of the small bore combat rifle cartridges, 5.56 NATO, 5.45, the Soviet 5.45 round, the Chinese 5.8 round, these are all fine. They all do the job. They may not be 100% optimized, but they're all at least 90 or 95% optimized, and that's plenty good enough for what they need to do, in my opinion. Mike says, what is the best firearms-related gift you have ever received? Not necessarily the most valuable, but the one that had the most meaning to you. That's a tricky one. I had to think about that. Over my life collecting firearms, especially starting as a fairly young person, I never really got guns as gifts. I think those people who were giving me, birthday and Christmas gifts always looked at it and went, A, they're really expensive, and B, I don't know what he's really looking for, so forget it. We'll do something else, and Ian can deal with his own firearms. To be honest, my father was the same way with books. He loved military history books and technical reference books, and however, if you were looking at trying to get one as a gift for him, it was like, he probably already has this thing, or it's not the right version of the thing, so we'll just not buy dad books. So hopefully I'm not insulting anyone that I have forgotten about who did give me a really cool gun, but the thing that came to mind was actually a book, and it is, where do you go? This book, right here. The first machine gun I ever bought was a Vickers heavy machine gun, and when I did that, a very good friend of mine gave me a copy of Dolph Goldsmith's book, The Grand Old Lady of No Man's Land, which is the quintessential, the essential reference guide to the Vickers heavy machine gun. And unfortunately, it is a book that is long out of print, and when these things actually show up for sale, they sell for hundreds of dollars, like insane prices for copies of this book. I have seen people spend $500 to get this book. So I don't know if my friend actually bought this one for me or if he had a spare copy, which is entirely possible knowing the guy. But it was really cool to be given a copy of this book to go along with my Vickers heavy machine gun. And while I actually no longer have the Vickers gun, I am very happy to still have the book because it's an excellent reference and it's a really darn hard thing to actually find. All right, our next question is from Ethan, who says, given what we know about infantry combat now, would the United States have been better off ditching the Krag-Jorgensen rifle but keeping the 30-40 cartridge? The 30-40 is certainly not an intermediate cartridge, but given that it is less powerful and has less recoil than the 30-06, I find the idea of a 30-40 1903 Springfield or a 30-40 M1 Garand interesting. I agree in terms of ballistics. That would be interesting. Not that much different, perhaps, from a 276 Pedersen rifle in cartridge in either of those rifles. However, as in a literal sense, no, the U.S. Army was absolutely right to get rid of the 30-40 cartridge because it is a very rimmed cartridge, and that is an absolute problem for repeating firearms. That, I don't know if they probably did recognize that at the time because everybody was going to rimless cartridges. Those few countries that stuck with the rimmed rounds, the Russians with 7.62x54 and the British with their 303 cartridge, those countries would face hurdles and problems as a result when they were trying to design magazine rifles and machine guns because of those rimmed cartridges. Had to get rid of that rim. It made sense in black powder periods, absolutely not by the turn of the century. So yeah, a 30-40 rimless would have been interesting. Definitely, I would be in favor of tinkering around with an intermediate cartridge sort of idea in some of the earlier firearms like the M1. Having handled, not fired, unfortunately, but handled a 276 caliber Trials M1, man, that thing was really nice. And I'd love to get a chance to actually do some live range time shooting with one. Next question is from Mika. Says, what is the next planned international destination for you, and any particularly tasty ones we can expect to see from said trip in the near future? Well, when you are watching this, when this video posts, I will have returned already, but while I am recording this video, I am actually just around the corner from a roughly 2-week trip to South Africa, which I'm really looking forward to. The plan there, I don't want to mention any specifics for fear that, who knows, something falls through and I don't get a chance to film a gun that I was planning to, and thus disappointing people. But the plan is to spend a significant period of time doing some filming of relatively modern guns. Think stuff being manufactured today back through the 1990s with a modern manufacturer of firearms and ordnance in South Africa. And I'm also going to be doing some filming with one or more private collections of older 1950s through like 1980s, both South African and Rhodesian manufactured firearms. So those are going to be very interesting, I think. South Africa, and especially Rhodesia, being on the receiving end of international sanctions, developed really insulated domestic small arms industries, and those created some interesting ideas. In fact, as a general rule, every time you get a really insular development sort of program, you end up with some unusual ideas, things that are a little bit out of the box. And Rhodesia and South Africa are one place where we see that. So I'm really looking forward to that. By the time you see this, those videos will be in the bag, so hopefully they're cool. Next up, where was I, is Tony. Says, what would you recommend an unabashed Anglophile, no judgment against you Francophiles, look for in terms of an interesting forgotten British gun to add to the collection? What is just so British that I have to have it? Well, I I'm not exclusively interested in French firearms, I should point out. That may be the focus of my collection, but it is not an exclusive one. I would say there are, in my mind, there are two particular types of firearms that just exude Britishness, and they are Lee Enfield rifles, or Lee pattern bolt-action rifles, and Webley pattern revolvers. There are a couple basic standard ones that most people are aware of, and then there are a bunch of very, to my eye, very British, lesser-known versions. So in addition, the standard would be the #1 Mark III Enfield and the #4 Mark I Enfield. There are some other interesting ones. If you look at the long Lees, the Lee carbines in particular are really neat and cool. They're also quite rare and expensive. One that's it's expensive and rare, but not nearly as much as some of those, is the #1 Mark V, which is really neat. It's like a #1 Mark III Enfield, but it has the rear sight from a pattern 1913, or it's got a rear-mounted aperture sight, kind of like the #4 rifle would have, but different in design. But it's got that really distinctive SMLE nose cap as well. Those are really cool, and I see those around for about $1,000. So they made something like 20,000 of them in the 20s as part of the trials program, and they are out there. So that's a cool one to look for. And then, of course, Webley revolvers. I figured I'd pull out one of these. Some of Webley's products are just fantastically British. This is a WG target model, has actually a windage adjustable rear sight. It's chambered for .476 Enfield, which is a cartridge that I believe every box actually comes with a monocle in it. Really, really cool revolvers. And yes, these are a bit rare and expensive. A bit easier to acquire than these are the standard Mark VI .455 caliber Webleys. In my opinion, the only ones worth having are the ones still in .455. They're much easier to find shaved. The cylinder's cut down to fit .45 auto rim or to fit .45 auto with moon clips. Be very careful about those. These revolvers are not safe to shoot with .45 auto. That is well in excess of the intended pressure for .45 caliber Webley revolvers. So if you're going to do that, hand load and load light cartridges that match the pressure levels of .455 Webley. However, beyond that, you've also got the .38 caliber Webleys that were adopted in the 1920s and later on the principle that by that point, the British Army no longer had this officer corps of basically landed aristocratic gentry who could be relied upon to supply their own fancy, powerful revolvers and have trained themselves how to shoot them. Instead, they were starting to issue handguns to a lot of guys who didn't have much experience with them. They didn't have a lot of training budget for the things, and they came to the conclusion that the .38-200 cartridge was just a lot easier to hit with for someone who was less trained than the big .45 caliber ones. And those .38 caliber Webleys, manufactured through World War II in large numbers, are really quite inexpensive. You can shoot .38 Smith & Wesson in them just fine, and they're way better guns than a lot of people might give them credit for. Even those are really cool. So hopefully there's a couple ideas for you for very British cool forgotten weapons. Next question is from Cason, C-A-S-O-N. Says, were there any U.S. small arms designers or companies experimenting with intermediate cartridge designs to the level that the Germans and Russians were before World War II, specifically purpose-built intermediate cartridges and rifles that would fire them rather than technically sort of kind of maybe designs? Well, yes. The best example is not actually quite purpose-designed, but close to it, and that is variations on the theme of .351 Winchester self-loader. So the .351 WSL kind of fits the mold as an intermediate cartridge before World War I, even, in a self-loading rifle. Now, it was a mechanically simple system. It was just a plain blowback action, which is why the rifles are a little bit heavy and a little bit awkward. They have to have a really big weight connected to the bolt in order to cycle safely. And they even tried to go a step further with the .401 Winchester self-loader, which was honestly had some problems in the field. These guns were used in limited numbers militarily during World War I. And what's more interesting about them is there were versions that were adapted to try and create more modern guns. A great example is the US 1917 Burton rifle, which we have a video on. That was designed for aircraft use, but it was a rifle that absolutely would have been viable in an infantry role had it been followed up on. Even the French tinkered with an adaptation of basically taking 351 Winchester self-loader and chambering it, or necking it to accept an 8mm Spitzer AP bullet, and chambering that in a select fire blowback rifle / carbine thing. So I guess that's French. You were asking about American, but yeah, the Burton rifle in the US is a perfect example of that sort of experiment. Jonathan says, where do you personally like to get military surplus ammo for the more common calibers, like 8mm Mauser and 7.5 Swiss? Do you have a local supplier or a particular website, or just do a Google search? Couple answers to that. First off, I don't do a whole lot of military surplus at this point. It used to be cheap and easy and great to get, especially good quality, clean, reloadable surplus. A lot of that has kind of dried up, and what does still exist has gone up in price to the point that often it's not really any cheaper, or not a lot cheaper, than buying new production ammo. This is unfortunate. I really liked the days when you could get, like, you could get South African 308, 7.62 NATO in sealed packages for like 20 cents a round. You could get a variety of good quality 7.62 NATO for $200 per 1,000. That was awesome. That doesn't really exist anymore. So there are a few. 7.5 Swiss is a great one to buy surplus of because it's better quality than the new production ammo. But things like 7.62 by 54 and 8mm Mauser, the surplus has gone up in price. It's all corrosive. It's mostly all steel case. And I find it hard to justify buying the surplus. That being said, my primary source for ammunition is SG Ammo. They unfortunately don't give me any sort of kickback or discount. I don't get anything from them, in fact, except for the product they sell at the price they normally charge. But they have a nice wide selection of weird cartridges that I can get from them. They have pretty good prices. They have cheap shipping. They're fast. And I've never had any sort of problem with them. So there are a lot of ammo suppliers out there. If you're looking for something weird, or if you're really on a budget, the website to use is ammoseek.com. Punch in the caliber you're looking for, and in my experience, that site has done a great job of cataloging what's actually out there at the moment. Not bringing back search results of things that are sold out, but what you can actually get right now. And it allows you to view results based on price per cartridge. I found it to be very helpful when I'm looking for something that SG Ammo just doesn't have. Next up is Jeffrey, who says, why didn't more countries adapt straight pull bolt action rifles? Was it simply a cost benefit analysis, or are there real functional disadvantages to the system? Pretty much cost benefit. A lot of people have the notion that a straight pull rifle is a lot faster than a traditional turn bolt. It's kind of not really in practice. The problem is, when you are running a typical bolt action rifle, you have a lot of leverage on this several inch long bolt handle to lift it up and unlock the action. When you're using a straight pull rifle, it has to do the same thing. The bolt head has to rotate to unlock the locking lugs before it can extract the cartridge. And the way those things work is they're all, in one form or another, a cam system, where when you pull the bolt handle back, you've got some sort of angled surfaces that act on each other and force the bolt to rotate. The problem is, you don't have nearly as much leverage because everything has to be contained inside the bolt mechanism. And as a result, you tend to get actions where it requires a substantial jerk on the bolt in order to unlock and open those things, especially if your ammunition is at all sticky. A little high pressure, chamber's a little dirty, anything like that. They can become fairly difficult to operate. And what that means is often you have to take the rifle maybe down out of, just down out of your line, out of your sight picture. Maybe you have to take it completely off your shoulder in order to actually cycle the action. And when you do that, all of a sudden, any speed advantage of a straight pull goes away. You might as well have had a turn bolt that you could fire, that you could keep in your shoulder pocket while you're shooting and have better results. In addition, even in the best circumstances, the speed advantage is not all that great. And in a classic military sense, when you're looking at this from the perspective of, ordnance generals in the era when militaries were equipped with bolt-action rifles, it wasn't that important to have, the difference in how many tenths of a second a guy had for cycling the bolt really wasn't that big of a deal. So when you look at that, and then we have the cost-benefit analysis where these are more complicated systems to build. Instead of a bolt and a bolt head, now you've got a bolt and a bolt sleeve and a bolt head, and you're trying to cut camming surfaces on the inside of your bolt sleeve in order to make the whole thing work. These get expensive. You end up with them being adopted by people like the Swiss, who are perfectly happy to spend a whole bunch of money on an individual service rifle, maybe because they never get in wars and don't have to replace a lot of them very often. So I think that's what it comes down to. Next question is from William. Said, if you were head of small arms development for the 1920s/30s Soviet Union, how would you change or improve the Mosin Nagant rifle? Easy. I would replace the cartridge. If the Russians had ditched the 7.62x51 and they had gone to a rimless cartridge, that would have not just improved the Mosin Nagant, but it would have improved a lot of their other small arms program. It would have made the SVT a much easier gun to make. It would have made the machine guns simpler. The Soviet Union is saddled with that obsolete cartridge still to this day, and it would have been great for them if they could have ditched it in the 1920s. In terms of real specific application to the Mosin Nagant, it would mean you would no longer need the interrupter mechanism. You would not have been stuck with a single stack magazine. They could have gone to a 10-round magazine if they'd wanted to, or a flush-mounted 5-round magazine like virtually every Mauser pattern rifle out there. It would have improved their stripper clips. Mosin Nagant stripper clips are just not good, and it's because they have to have a way to envelop the rim and then also the bottom of the body of the cartridge, just like British .303 stripper clips. If they'd been able to go to a Mauser-style clip because they had a rimless cartridge, that would have been a big advantage, I think. So that's the easy answer for me for how to improve the Mosin. And interestingly, a couple people actually did. The Poles and I believe the Turks both adapted the Mosin Nagant to 8mm Mauser. And I don't know if that solved a whole lot of problems because converting like that raises a whole new set of issues, but had they manufactured them new, that would have been an interesting rifle to see. Next up is from Sleep. Straight blowback can be thought of as an inertial lock mechanism. There isn't a mechanical locking surface, but the laws of physics will do. Are there firearms that use an inertial lock that is not the straight blowback version of that mechanism? Yes. In the modern day, we have Benelli shotguns that use an inertial locking system, and you can trace that back to the Sjogren from the turn of the 1900s to the beginning of the 1900s, like 1905. Sjogren was a Scandinavian semi-auto 12-gauge shotgun that used a very early inertial locking system. The idea being it's sort of like the reverse of a recoil-operated system where you have a locking block under spring pressure. When the gun fires, recoil is going to push the gun back, but that locking block, because of Newton's laws, is going to tend to stay at rest while the gun moves back around it, and that serves to unlock the action and then allow the it's not really a bolt, it's like a bolt slide block on the Sjogren to cycle. I do actually have a video on the Sjogren, including some shooting footage with it. I do not believe that video has published as of when this Q&A is going up, but I will make sure it is coming up before too long. Next is from Mac. Actually, we have two questions here that are similar. Mac says, what do you think about the FX05, the Mexican service rifle? And Kyle says, what do you know about the Howa Type 89, current Japanese service rifle? The answer to both of those is, I really have no idea. I have never seen either one in person. None of them exist on the civilian market in the United States that I am aware of. They're probably one or two in some collection of some guy who has a connection to the right military people. The FX05 is very much based on the German G36. The Howa Type 89 is fundamentally based on the AR-18. My understanding is they're both perfectly serviceable rifles, but never had the chance to look at one. Don't know that I ever will here in the United States. I think those are guns that will require trips to specific places that have them, whether Mexico and Japan directly or some sort of military sort of school Maybe there's one in England that has them. I don't know. With modern guns, it's harder to get access to that sort of stuff than it is with older ones. The older guns have often been used in wars, lost, captured by other people, and thus there are more of them spread around the planet. Moving on, we have a question from Nick. Who says, generally speaking, what is the process for making a legal firearm from an open bolt submachine gun parts kit? Well, there are a couple important steps, and this is all based on United States law. So if you're not in the US, I don't know. I would also say this is absolutely not to be considered legal advice. In general, what you have to do is first manufacture a brand new receiver. Generally under US law, if you get a parts kit, the receiver will have been destroyed legally. Sometimes you'll get the parts left over, the remnants of a destroyed receiver. That destroyed receiver is legally nothing. It's just scrap metal. And so if you weld it together, you are creating a new receiver. So first thing you have to do is create a new receiver, which is not a machine gun in and of itself. Otherwise, you have just manufactured a machine gun, and that is illegal. You need to make a new receiver that is modified such that machine gun parts can't be fitted in it in a way that ATF deems making it into a machine gun. This is usually done with denial surfaces so that original parts won't fit in, or in the case of tube guns, sometimes changing the diameter of the tube so that original parts can't fit in it. The second thing you have to do is convert the gun from open bolt operation to closed bolt operation. ATF has determined that open bolt semi-automatic firearms are easily convertible into machine guns and thus are not legally permissible. They are considered, if something is easily convertible into a machine gun, it's considered a machine gun already. So you have to convert it to open bolt in order for it to be legal. That is traditionally a bit tricky. That's one of the tricky parts on an open bolt submachine gun. Submachine guns, typically open bolt subguns, don't have a separate firing pin. They have a firing pin that's just like a nub permanently milled into the front of the bolt face. So you're going to have to get rid of that and replace it with some sort of system that allows the bolt to close on a cartridge in the chamber and then have a separate firing mechanism, either a striker or a hammer. If you are making a rifle, you do have to also pay attention to 922R, which limits the number of foreign-made parts that may be in a rifle in the United States. If you're making a pistol, or if you're registering something as a short-barreled rifle, then 922R does not apply. So you have to pay attention to all of those. And then whether you have to actually submit the gun to ATF is a little bit of a gray area. My understanding is technically you don't have to. You can just build it as long as it is a semi-automatic firearm. If ATF shows up, let's say you're out shooting it, and some ATF agent walks over and goes, that looks like a machine gun, and they confiscate it, and they take it to Tech Branch, and they determine that it is, in fact, considered a machine gun for some reason that maybe you don't agree with, but they consider it a machine gun. Well, congratulations, you're a criminal, and you're going to court and then jail. What any manufacturer does, anyone who's going to be doing this for a commercial basis, they're going to take their design, they're going to register it as a machine gun, they're going to send it to ATF and ask for a determination. Is this a machine gun or not? And then assuming that it's not, ATF will send it back and say, we have determined this is not a machine gun. And then they have a letter from ATF approving their design and they can go ahead and sell it, being confident that they are not manufacturing illegal machine guns and they're not selling them to their customers. So if you want to be on the safe side, you would submit your design to ATF and get their approval of it. If you are, say, copying an existing approved design, you don't technically have to send yours to ATF. As long as you're confident that if they do get their hands on it and inspect it, they will end up judging it to be semi-auto and not full auto. So that went a little bit long, but that's the basic process for making a semi-auto rebuild of a subgun. Last question here, number 25, is from Luke. He says, I recently purchased a Remington model 1907/15, which is a Berthier, and other than the inconvenience and expense of tracking down 8mm Lebel ammo, I love it. I have done a little reading on the Remington contract Berthiers, and I know they were not accepted into French service. I'm wondering why the French turned them down, despite being seemingly desperately in need of rifles in 1915/16. Well, you are correct. They did definitely need rifles. The problem was, oh, and by the way, they did actually accept a batch of Remington Berthiers. About 10,000 were in fact accepted into French service. The problems with them were they were far behind schedule. Remington had a lot of other projects going on at the time. It was making a bunch of other rifles and machine guns for other countries, including the US. And the Berthier was kind of lower on its priority list. Above that was making Mosin Nagants for the Russians. So they missed a whole bunch of production deadlines. When the rifles did arrive, there were a couple places, the front sights in particular, didn't meet French specification. And I haven't been able to tell exactly what it was about the front sight that didn't meet French spec, but the guns that the French did finally accept into service had to be substantially rebuilt by the French arsenal system. And by the time that the Remingtons were being actually finally delivered in quantity, the French were very close to adopting the M16 upgrade to the rifles. Now, that doesn't appear to have actually factored into their decision to cancel Remington's contract. That contract cancellation was specifically based on not meeting delivery deadlines. And when you get that, combined with the fact that they had trouble, that the rifles had to be refitted, reworked by the French system, it just wasn't, it was more of a drain on French resources to try and deal with this source of just a few rifles that weren't quite right, than it was to say, forget it, we're going to allocate those resources that would have been spent fixing Remington guns into just increasing our own production. So there was a French company, Establissement Delaunay Belleville, a former automobile manufacturer, that was a private contractor that manufactured 0715 Berthiers for the French government. So they did have, there weren't a lot of them, but they did have external commercial contract manufacture of the rifles. The problem, honestly, was Remington couldn't hold up its end of the contract. And so that's why it got canceled. And that is all of the questions we have time for today. Thank you very much to everyone who submitted questions. I generally get like 5, 6, 7 times as many questions or more as I am able to answer. So if, like Luke, you did not get your question answered today, please do resubmit it next month when I ask again. And when I see questions that are repeated, I try extra hard to get them into the lineup. So thank you again to everyone on Patreon for making the channel possible, and tune in tomorrow for another cool forgotten weapon. Thanks for watching.